thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This is just remarkable. Thank to John Scholes and James Cito and the DSA and the sponsors for bringing me here. It is amazing to see all of you here. You know, it's been a long time since I had a suit and a tie on, and and I'm going to talk more about that. It's nice to get back to work, and I don't think I'm the only one that feels that way. It's great to be back in this city. I've been here a lot. I've been coming here for a long time, and I've seen the incredible things that you've accomplished in this city and in this downtown. This is a time of great challenge. It's a time of reinvention. It's a time of a reset. Title of a book I wrote in 2008. It's a time to work hard together, and the future of this downtown rests on all of your shoulders. I want to start by saying congratulations. I don't know if you saw it, but I saw it this week. A group of people at Axios did a survey. And that survey was of 4,000 or 5,000 young, ambitious college graduates, asking them where, after their college graduation, they would like to live and work. Guess what city was named number one? Seattle. And I think it didn't surprise me, but I think it surprised some people. Not only was Seattle named number one, it excelled in every category. I think it was number one for men and number two for women. I may have that backwards, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. It was number one for independents, number two for Democrats, a little lower for Republicans. Not terribly low, though, but in the top 15. And it was number one for high-income earners, number one for middle-income earners, and number two for youngsters who might want to pursue a career in community service or nonprofit, making less income. It was attractive to everyone. And what's so interesting about that survey is if you look at the data closely, it looked at many, many cities. And when you looked at it, Seattle was really in an elite class with one other city, New York City. Now think about that. I mean, New York City is the biggest, the greatest, the global city, the center of finance and headquarters and the arts and culture. It was Seattle and New York, and then it trailed off. Then there was LA, San Francisco, and Chicago, and then everyone else trailed off. It's really remarkable. Now look, I've been a student of cities for 3 or 4 decades now. And in all of my life, I never thought, even though your old Bill Gates talked a lot about pandemics, I never thought about it. My mom and dad were born in the 1920s, but they were about the youngest of big Italian-American families, 7 in each. It means most of my aunts and uncles were born during the Great Flu. Now, my parents talked a lot about the Great Depression. My dad talked a lot about his service in World War II. Never a word was uttered in our family about the Great Flu. I never studied it, never heard about it, never was taught about it in undergraduate and graduate school, never taught about it in my classes, and then this pandemic struck. So I had to go back and do a pretty big study of how pandemics, infectious disease, pestilence affect cities. I read a lot. I read a lot about the history of these things, previous epidemics, the Great Flu, the cholera epidemic, tuberculosis epidemics, the plagues that swept Europe. I had a lot of time to do that. I didn't have any place to go, but that's neither here nor there. In my PJs. What I learned is cities are far stronger than infectious disease. When the Great Plague swept through Europe, killing 30 or 40 or 50% of the cities of Italy and parts of Western Europe, those cities rebounded quickly because as those plagues receded, young people, ambitious people, returned to cities not only to rebuild, but for the greater economic opportunity they offered. London in the wake of the cholera epidemic. Think about the tragedies that have befallen great cities. the Great Fire in London, the bombings of World War II. Look at what's happening in Kiev. I learned about this because I'm a kid from New Jersey. I became an urbanist because I watched my city, Newark, fall victim to the riots. We were driving down the street. My dad was taking me. He wanted me to learn how to play guitar. Come back to that. And also wanted me to study hard. Was taking me to the Newark Library and my guitar lesson. I was just a little boy. And we heard shots fired out. And the city was ablaze, and there were tanks in the streets of my hometown. And the officers said, "Turn around, sir. There are shots being fired. The city's on fire." I watched as New York was attacked by terrorists in 9/11. People said you never could rebuild the financial district. In every one of those cases, we've rebuilt. My hometown of Newark is coming back, is attracting investment, was a finalist, think about this, for Amazon's competition. My hometown of Newark. We've survived worse and more. We will survive this. This is not the end of cities, and I wrote that. I wrote that and published that in April of 2020 when people said I was from the moon. We're beginning to see the glimmers of that, and this event is part of those glimmers. Now, we certainly have challenges, but we also have opportunities. I want to focus on that, and it's been the focus of my work over the past 2 years. What COVID has done, what this pandemic has done, is not really been a disruption. We're not going to go back to prehistoric times. Cities aren't going to fade away. The downtown's not going to collapse. Cities aren't going to remain empty. What it really did is accelerate a series of changes that were already at work in our society, in our cities. That quote about, it's no longer, that comes from my life in Pittsburgh, my 20 years in Pittsburgh. It's no longer coal and iron ore, no longer wood and timber and fish and all the great resources of this great area of the world. It's knowledge, it's intelligence, it's human creative capabilities. It's human capacities. For the first time in human history, that's what drives growth. I wrote about this in my book 20 years ago, Rise of the Creative Class, when I charted the change in our economy. 100 years ago, less than 5% of the workforce were members of what I call the creative class of artists, designers, innovators, entrepreneurs, researchers, business professionals, knowledge workers like us. We were an industrial, resource-driven society. Most people, like my grandparents and my father, worked in factories or in farms and in resource-extractive industries. Even as late as 1950, less than 10% of America's workforce were members of this creative class of innovators and creators. Today, 60 million Americans are members of the creative economy. And that economy is organized in and around cities. It requires the clustering of talented and creative people. That is what the great economist Robert Lucas, in his address when he accepted the Nobel Prize, said is the main motor force of all of economic progress. It's the clustering, it's the collaboration, it's the connectivity that comes when creative people cluster in communities and neighborhoods and cities and downtown. That's the economic juice. Well, Seattle's at the center of that. You have nearly 1 million people in this metropolitan area that are members of the creative class. One of the highest percentages, nearly 45% of your workforce does this creative work. And the pandemic is accelerating that, accelerating this shift, and accelerating the importance of this clustering. Seattle has always been a center for this. When I wrote my book, it's not like it's just an overnight success. The kids that I was talking to at Carnegie Mellon University were already naming Seattle as one of their #1 locations, along with the Bay Area and Austin, Texas, that they wanted to live and work in. Downtowns are not dying. Downtowns are being transformed. You see, we have this mistaken notion in our head, and this is what I've been writing a lot about, that a downtown is an office district. Downtown's an office district, but it's much, much more than an office district. This transformation of downtowns that we're living through has been going on for 50 years. My mentor, a woman named Jane Jacobs, the greatest urbanist who ever walked this earth, wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961. You know what her original article that made her famous was? Written before most of us in this room were born, or when we were little kids in 1958. If you remember one thing, remember this. She wrote this in 1958. Downtown is for people. Downtown is for people. Downtown is not a collection of office towers, just like the city was never a collection of factories. There was a time where Seattle and Detroit and Cleveland and Toronto, and I go down the list, were factory towns. Remember it? Some of us here are old enough to remember it. And remember when people said our downtowns were deindustrializing? They'd never come back. This is why Newark was on its knees. This is why New York City went bankrupt. Those old fallow manufacturing sites and warehouses, what happened? What happened here in Seattle? Old warehouse loss, all factory sites, old hospitals where cities are never completed. They're built and rebuilt constantly. They were reused. They became art galleries and creative centers, incredible centers. Look, we talk about innovation and technology in this town. This town is one of the greatest musical histories, centers of popular music creativity in the world, of cuisine, creativity in the arts, in technology. Our downtowns aren't about offices. In fact, I would submit that this conception that we have, that downtowns are just central business districts, is the last gasp of the industrial age. The idea that you would simply use a downtown, like this great downtown, to pack and stack office workers who sit in a cubicle from 9 to 5, doing work that they can do anywhere. Packing and stacking of office workers made sense 50 years ago when you didn't have technology and the internet and you had to have typing pools and people had to pass paper back and forth. It makes no sense. Downtowns have already been changing. Look at yours. They've been adding hotels and restaurants. John's going to show you, what a remarkable report. Congratulations, I got to look at an earlier draft. John's going to show you the addition of residential. What happened in New York City's financial district? I co-wrote one of the reports. We said New York City's financial district should become a creative center, an innovative center, a mixed-use 24/7 neighborhood. And people thought but we lost our minds. Guess what the financial district is today? Filled with hotels, filled with shops, filled with restaurants, some of the hippest spots and all. It's a 24/7 live end. There's a bigger point that I've only learned now. It took this pandemic for me to learn this one. We've always thought about cities and downtowns, and I helped coin this term. We're about live, work, and play. You've talked about it. Downtowns all over the world have talked about it. Live, work, and play. I think I sold downtown short. Downtowns are, of course, about living. They're, of course, about centers, and they're still going to remain, even as work distributes to people's homes and to suburban office parks, and we reuse some of those old abandoned retail malls and some of the older suburban sites. That's a net good. If work spreads out a little, and it spreads out to places like from New York City to my hometown of Newark, and people get to commute less, that's a net good. But there's something downtown does that no other part of your metropolitan area does. Even though I love other parts of your metropolitan area and have spent a lot of time in them. Live, work, play, connect. See, the thing I didn't realize, the pandemic has taught me, is that the real key to understanding downtowns and cities is not that they're containers for living and containers for working and places to shop and play. Look at us. Look at us. Look at this room. You're not here to live, well, maybe you're going to play a little. You're here to connect. You miss your friends. You miss your colleagues. I went to New York City, a city I love. I got my ass on a plane in July, and I was scared to death, and I put 14 masks on. And I had sanitizer, full body wash of sanitizer. And I was scared. I'm a professor. We're very risk averse. I think you know. I got my butt on the plane, and I went to New York. And yes, there were challenges. There were homeless people. There were bags. Well, my wife, we once had dinner with Mayor Mike Bloomberg. My wife's insane. And she's giving me two of the loveliest my girls are 4 and 6. They miss Daddy. She said, Mayor Bloomberg, why are there bags of trash piled as high as I am tall on the streets of New York? And the trash bags were higher than we've ever seen them. And there were vermin in the city I love. I went to Midtown. Oh, my God. My heart was broken. The towers were dark. There was nobody going to the office. I walked around. There was nobody on the street. Hold on. The clock hit 4:30. It was as if, I don't know, someone flipped a switch. For every bar and restaurant in Midtown, there were people dressed like us wrapped around the block. Nobody was coming to the office. They were all going out to drink and eat with their colleagues. And everything city was back. The restaurants were back, and then the theaters come back, and then the sports arenas come back, and then the basketball comes back, and the Final Four is back. The only thing that's not back is the office. This is telling us something. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to read this. The idea that people feel that they must be constrained to a single place to work is over. But they need this place to connect. And that's real. Look at the new convention center you're building. Look at how people love, they want to be. And you know what? You have an advantage. This is a beautiful city with natural beauty. It's a tourist city. You have the cruises. You have spectacular hotels, spectacular restaurants, spectacular nightlife. There aren't a lot of cities. You know, there's New York and Chicago. And then, you know, there's Miami for fun in the sun, and maybe Las Vegas. And then you are one of the few cities in this country, in this continent, that people really want to be in and want to come to. And moreover, you're a big metropolitan area. You're going to draw in people from the suburbs, but you're part of a mega region, this Cascadia region, Vancouver, Portland, Seattle, you know, nearly 10 million people, 650 billion in economic output, bigger than Switzerland or Sweden. You're the center of it. This idea of really focusing on your connective fiber. You see, remote work is both a challenge and an opportunity for you. And I know the statistics. I've studied this inside out, and I get to work with the best people in the world. The best that we can estimate is that roughly 20% of working days will be done remotely after the pandemic is through. That's up. It was less than 5% before the pandemic. They're saying it could be up to 20%, and that will be higher because, you know, there are some people, essential workers, service workers, manufacturing workers, who can't work remotely. So it'll take a bigger bite out of the professional working group. But that's only a fifth of working days. That's not all. I just want to put this, it's 20%. 80% of people are still going to go to work. And when you really parse the data on remote work, there's a difference between remote work and working from home. Not 20% of the people working in their house in PJs and sweatsuits, not taking a shower, not leaving. No. In fact, the preponderance of remote workers don't work at home. They work outside the home. They work in a coffee shop, a restaurant lobby, a friend's house. They go visit their friends. They're bored. They go to a co-working space. They go to a library. You see, that's what we have to think about. How do we begin to adjust this downtown for the realities of remote work? How do you build an ecosystem that is capable of dealing with this remote, and because you're so techy and you're so innovative, you have an advantage. Think about your economic mix. If you just look at who's taken space, new study came out, CRBE, the great preponderance of people taking leases in this metro are tech companies. Amazon, Microsoft, the biomedical community, small startup community, 2 million square feet. A third of all new space leased was leased by tech companies. 4.5 million square feet in New York City. We think about downtowns, they used to have this word FIRE, finance, insurance, real estate. No, downtowns are about that. You know, big tech companies took 3 times, almost 4 times as much real estate in this metropolitan area as finance, insurance, and real estate companies. So the nature of our and that's not the small companies, the creative companies, the places that use older spaces, more dilapidated spaces, grungier spaces, because they can't afford it. The nature of our downtowns are becoming, and you were a leader in this. When I wrote my book, Rise of the Creative Class, and I was writing that book in the late 1990s, there was only one downtown in the country where I could find tech companies moving out of the suburbs and into downtown. That wasn't happening in New York. New York hadn't taken off yet. Wasn't happening in Boston. It was all out in the suburbs. Wasn't happening in Austin. Wasn't happening, San Francisco was happening in the Silicon Valley. Seattle was the first mover as a place that tech companies and innovative companies and startups began to locate in your downtown. So the nature of your downtown has been changing. You're becoming more residential. You've been adding mixed use. You're becoming more vibrant. You're becoming more exciting. And you have to double down on that. You have to think long and hard about converting some of these buildings to residential. We've heard about, look, I just looked at your housing. You're one of the most expensive places to live in the country now. Not quite the Bay Area, but you're now, the city is nearing $1 million. It's $915,000 median housing price. Yimby, nimby, bimby, you need to get more housing on the books, and one way to do it is to begin to think about converting some of these offices. Now, I think there's other things. You know, I don't think all of it needs to go. I have a good friend who runs, in fact, I'm vice chair of his company in Toronto, runs a major Toronto-based real estate company, and he said something really interesting, where in Toronto, remember, whatever your figures are, multiply times 10, because we were in the longest lockdown in North America, so nobody's back to work. And he said he met with his staff, and his staff, he said, you know, half our people, more than half, 3/4 of our people are working remotely, many want to stay, but we need more space. My buddy said, how could that be? He said, because we've expanded so much and hired so many people, we need to add another floor as people want to come back. The other thing is that our economy has been so hot, and so many companies that are urban-oriented have added so many people, they need more space. The other thing that I think the surveys are overly gloomy. I'm being honest with you. I'm a survey researcher. I'm trained in survey. I can't prove this, but look. To me, I'm a remote worker. I'm a writer. I'm a thinker. You heard the bio. I write books. You don't write books, you know, in an office. When people come in, you write them at home in a study. I don't want to stay home anymore. I'm tired of staying home. I'm tired of being in the basement. I want to get out. I want to go somewhere. I've never been excited to take a 6-hour plane ride like this in my life. I wanted to put a suit on. I was so excited I could shave. Do you think I'm the only one like that? Am I the only lunatic? People like people. We are social animals. I don't know what's wrong with people in this society. They get gloomy and doomy. I understand it's post-traumatic stress. You're scared to go out. You're scared to go to the airport. Somebody yesterday had the damn visor on still. Yeah, I understand it. But sooner or later, even scaredy cats like me go, the hell with this stuff. I think once the weather gets nicer, mark my words, unless we're struck by another variant, as spring turns to summer, we are going to see a new day dawn. We are going to see more people than anyone ever expected saying, the hell with this remote work from home and I'm going back. I just think that's 100%, and you can count me on that. Keep me to my word. I think there's two things you need to do, in addition to all the other things you need to do. One, I think you've really got to get out in front of building a downtown that's about connectivity. I'm writing up something for the London Spectator now on the comeback of London. And one of the things I've been researching on is London. London has invented so many of these we call them third places, neither work, no home, places that people can connect, a bar, a tavern, a hair salon, whatever. But London has invented so many of these new forms. The Soho House is the most obvious one, but people say, oh, that's old, backward. All of these new kinds of co-working spaces that are kind of like a coffee shop, and they blend hospitality and work, but they have literally dozens upon dozens. Deep thinking now about what would be the kind of workspace of the future. WeWork was a stab at it. and they overshot. What would it look like? And you know, you're pretty good with your coffee culture, and you're pretty good at building third places here. What would those third spaces of the future, what would vehicles for this new kind of remote work, what would a remote work ecosystem really, really, really look like, as opposed to the downtown? And then I think the other thing that we talked about, I'm not an expert in it, but I heard the panel, this idea that of not just homelessness, not just crime, what I would call this rise of urban disorder that really gets people fearful. It's everywhere. It's not just you, it's everywhere. It's in every city. Now, it's very much an American affliction. It's not something that people are real worried about in Toronto. I think that's because we're a hyper-individualistic culture. We're a very materialistic culture. I think some of the things that were said on the panel about us not dealing enough with issues of inequity. And look, this crisis has deepened inequity. Whether it's the housing price surge, whether it's the wages of the super rich or even the creative class opposed to the wages of essential workers, that spread. Whether it's the incidence of death, morbidity, sickness with the virus. It has shown our deep divisions of race and class. So I think you got to take this on. I think in everything you do, you got to put inclusivity at the center of it. You can't just be better police. It ain't going to work. You ain't going to police this stuff away. You've got to make sure that, and I think one place to start, you know, the gap has never been wider between not only the super rich, but the creative class and the essential workers. You know, there are two great classes in our society today: the essential workers, the people who serve us in retail shops, take care of us in this hotel, deliver stuff to our homes, man those logistics in the warehouses. We got to get their wages up. And here, right here in downtown, folks, take a stab. Raise the wages of these essential workers to living wages. Make sure they can find affordable housing. Give them a purpose and a meaning. And let me just say, my dad told me, my dad worked in an eyeglass factory at 13 to help support the family. It took 9 people to support that family. And he said, when I came back from World War II, same job in the same eyeglass factory, my wages rose, as if by magic. It wasn't magic. We had a Wagner Act. We gave workers the right to organize. FDR said we want to have a society, we want to have an American dream. And as the economy fired up after the war, my dad, a guy with a 7th grade education, had enough money to get married, to buy a house, to have 2 kids, and to put them through Catholic school and college. That middle class built on the backs of manufacturing workers, that wasn't a God-given thing. We made that happen for our people. We have to do it for the service workers. Anyway, look, I'm a professor, which means I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, so I can keep you here all day. I want to give you a little reflection on one of the very first trips. I'd come to Seattle before, but probably the first time I ever interacted with folks like you. You might not even remember. Most of you are not old enough to remember. It was 25 years ago. And I was brought on a walking tour of your downtown 25 years ago. Your downtown didn't look this good. Sorry. Your downtown looked run down. There was homeless people everywhere. There were shops with all battered up, boarded up doors. There was a little tiny coffee shop, I'm sure. It was one of the first Starbucks shops. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this new construction. I write about it in Rise of the Creative Class. New construction project. I said, what the hell is that thing? They said, oh, that's what one of our city fathers, a guy named Paul, the late Paul Allen, I had no idea who he was. I knew Bill Gates. I had no idea who Paul Allen was, is doing for the city. So goofy old Rich is thinking, oh, Microsoft guy. That has to be your new Seattle Science Center. Well, that's not a science center. Are you nuts, Rich? Okay, so I said, no, this guy, he was an entrepreneur. That's a technology center. It's not about the great scientists. It's about Edison. And no, it's not. I said, oh, it's got to be an entrepreneurship center about his. No. You know what it is. It's a Jimi Hendrix Experience Music Project. That's your DNA. Jimi Hendrix Experience Music Project. Guess who was my boyhood idol? You want to guess? It wasn't John Lennon. It wasn't Paul McCartney. It wasn't Eric Clapton. My boyhood idol was a black kid from Seattle named Jimi Hendrix. He wasn't only my boyhood idol. He was Paul Allen's boyhood idol. This creative spark. It's not techie to techie or scientist to scientist. You have this thing in your DNA called creativity. You have shown it ages. I come back here now, and I look at this downtown. Yes, it's stiller than we'd like it to be. Yes, it has challenges. But I compare this downtown today to what I saw 25 years ago. You've already done the hard work. You've already built your downtown back. You've already positioned this city for success. We have a tough road ahead of us, but together you can do it. It's such a great pleasure to be back with you. And thanks so much for having me, and best of luck in all your work.